I see my man in the background, the one, the only Mark Sleboda. How you doing, Mark? You doing okay this evening?
I'm alive. How the hell are you, Jamaro? Thanks for having me. It's always an honor and a pleasure to be on the show.
I am breathing. My heart is beating, so I'm going to go with the thing that I'm alive to, Mark. Mark Sleboda, he's an international relations security analyst. You can follow Mark on his Boosty, Boosty, Realpolitik with Mark Sleboda, or you can just put in Mark Sleboda. He will appear. Mark does put all of his interviews and everything else up on his channel. It is a fantastic channel to get analysis on international relations, specifically around the area of Russia. Mark, always appreciate having you, man. Let's start, I guess, with corruption. There is, let's say, there is a budding point of view. I call it that. There's a budding point of view that Naboo belongs to the
I've got
United
your
States.
kickback. Don't worry.
Huh?
I've got your kickback. Don't worry. You said we were
kickback?
doing corruption. You said we were doing corruption, right?
Oh, we're doing fair enough. Well, I was talking about corruption in Kiev or in Ukraine in this case, but fair enough. This story has been getting right much news, actually, and it's even been getting right much news in the West. I think it was the Telegraph says Zelensky needs to step aside. And also part of the narrative that has come up is because Naboo is believed to be controlled by the United States or by the Europeans, that this is their way of pushing him out in order to try to get somebody else more favorable in the position. Minrich left the country, went to Israel. I think it was two other ministers stepped down. And one of my other guests who used to actually be part of, let's say, the Kiev government, he was a whistleblower. He pointed out that Zelensky's name is in these files. That name just hasn't necessarily been mentioned yet. What is the effect? Is this really having this significant effect in the way that they're talking about in the West, that this is the thing that may actually get rid of Zelensky? In fact, Kolomoisky went so far as to say Zelensky will be gone soon. He's, quote, soon to be gone, calling him Generalissimo Napoleon IV.
That's referencing the fact that in one of the movies,
right.
his comedy movies made under Kolomoisky's production TV company, that Zelensky played Napoleon in a comedy, and that is a kind of bitter reference to that.
Who controls that?
Yeah. Okay, that's a good question, and I mean that gets to the heart of it, because corruption, right? Everyone knows Ukraine is corrupt. Yes. The Western media has reported that Ukraine has corrupt for the last decade, and there was, despite all of this erection of these quote unquote anti-corruption watchdogs, Naboo, Sapo, they were constructed by the US and the EU, right? And they still do, as far as anyone knows, maintain the commanding heights of these organizations. And they were intended as leverage, right? As leverage against the Kiev regime when and if they needed it. Because everyone in Ukraine in politics is corrupt. Yep. The last government in Ukraine, that of Yanukovych, was corrupt, and that was one of the biggest rationale of the Maidan, right? Was the Yanukovych government is corrupt, we need to overthrow it, right? That was the narrative, and of course the one that replaced it is even more corrupt than that one was, and you could go back. Ukraine has been mired in corruption since the dissolution of the Soviet Union, and they never had a Putin. They never had someone whom I would never venture to say that there is no corruption in Russia, but I would venture to say that today there is less corruption than there ever has been, and that in many real ways there is probably less corruption today in Russia than there is in the United States or the EU, or many countries within the EU. And the conflict in Ukraine has been used by the Kremlin to purge a lot of the corruption, particularly out of the Ministry of Defense and the general. I mean, we've seen that. We've seen numerous generals, right, go to court, being brought down and going to court, one after another, and until they learn the lesson that the existence of Russia is on the line. This is an existential conflict, and get your damn hands out of the cookie jar and do your job.
Right.
But Ukraine never had any of that. They never had this new political social contract that Russia had under Putin, where he told the oligarchs that, listen, I will not pursue you and the process by which you got your ill-gained, filthy lucre during the 1990s. I won't pursue that. But
right.
One, that process ends now. And two, you will stay the hell out of politics, or I will rain the FSB down on your heads, right? And that was the separation, right? The oligarchs were exiled to, I mean, nothing is 100%, but to a very large degree from politics, from buying politicians and the like. In Ukraine, that has never happened. To a large extent, politics is patronage clans from oligarchs in Ukraine. And Zelensky is a case in point because, as you mentioned, Igor Kolomoisky was the oligarch patron of Zelensky until in the last few years, Zelensky turned on him, bit the hand that fed him. And now I think Kolomoisky has long been plotting his revenge, and he's doing it from he's still under investigation and under arrest. He's in and out of court, and he feels that this is his revenge, and that Zelensky, the Generalissimo Napoleon IV, as you mentioned, is gone. So, but back to your question, who controls Nabu and Sapo, right? They haven't been unleashed till now. The regime is corrupt. That's been factored into the business model of fighting Russia through this proxy. It was understood that is just part of the model, right? That is the price of doing business with the Kiev regime, is that there is corruption, and everyone should just look the other way. I mean, in the Western mainstream media, until now, right? When top figures in personally close to Zelensky and within his, the tight circle in his regime have been implicated. So, I mean, this is obviously a power play by someone, right? Nabu and Sapo have fulfilled their functions. They were intended as weapons, right? They're not real anti-corruption watchdogs. They were intended as weapons, as leverage. The question is who is using this leverage, right? I think we can write the Europeans out. There's no indication at all that the Europeans have. I mean, they hug Zelensky, they kiss him, they throw themselves down at his feet. He's their best buddy. Macron, Starmer, Merz. There's no any indication. In fact, they have rallied around him multiple times through this. And it has to be said. Let's before I forget to come back to it. It's quite obvious that Zelensky saw this coming a mile away. Right?
Yes,
because he attempted to gain control of Nabu and Sapo. We were talking about it months ago, right? He was attempting to seize control, and he was blocked from doing so, largely by the Europeans. Now, they didn't pursue it any further, right? But they wanted to maintain that leverage. These protests started to tepid protests, the first real protests since the Maidan Putsch in 2014, right? And that was when Zelensky opened the doors for the first time since 2022 for Ukrainian men between the ages of 18 and 22. And a lot of people have, I think, correctly read that as an attempt to bleed the steam or the oxygen off of protests, right? Because young men are, the primary vehicle of protests everywhere in the world, and
Yeah.
if that reservoir is emptied with all of them fleeing into Europe, then there's less people. Now, of course, that's less people to conscript into his future army when they eventually lower that conscription age below 25, in line with the they haven't done it thus far due to the extreme social, hot button issue of Ukraine's future demographics and how small that contingent of young men is in demographic terms anyway, because Ukrainians haven't had children for the last 20, close to 30 years now. Because of the economic conditions and everything in Ukraine, their birth rate has gone to nothing. So they need to maintain that age group that could still have children if there's any hope of a future Ukraine, right? Ukraine's population has dropped from 50 million at the dissolution of the Soviet Union to somewhat less than 30 million, probably around 25 million right now, between high death rate, immigration out of the country, both ways, to Russia and to Europe, refugees to Russia and Europe, and of course, deaths as a result of the conflict. So, I mean, we can't imagine that demographic crisis when within 30 years, the population of a major country in population terms has halved. It's really inconceivable, right? So that's why they haven't touched that age group. But anyway, so back to who controls Nabu and Sapo. Are the Americans behind this? Okay. If they are being unusually and uncharacteristically quiet about this, which the Trump administration has never done that. They've never been good at that, right? There's always someone talking, if not Trump blabbing openly on his social media posts, talking about how bad Zelensky is or something like that. There's nothing. They're keeping almost eerily quiet over this whole affair. And that has led some people, I think, to believe that they are behind it, right? Rather than the opposite, right? It's one or the other, right? Either they are behind it and they're keeping unusually quiet, or they're not behind it and they don't want to lend fuel to the fire and they're trying to figure out what the hell is going on and how to react. Now, the former Ukrainian prime minister, under the end at Viktor Yanukovych, Azarov, in the former prime minister under Yanukovych.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So he's in political exile in Russia. He has come out and said that he believes that the U.S. is behind this. Okay, well, that's a serious individual, and he knows some things and so forth. So we can't completely discount that. Kirill Dmitriev, the Putin's shall we say, version of Witkoff, the head of the Russian Direct Investment Fund, who has been back and forth to the United States on this, diplomatic game. He noted how unusually quiet the White House has been about all of this in a social media post. And it's quite obvious that he is implying that he thinks that the White House, that Trump
is behind it.
Yeah, the White House is behind it. I'm not so sure about that because I haven't seen any signs of that. And there has been no effort made to elevate anyone else. And you would think that would be a prerequisite, right? If you're moving to get rid of someone, obviously you want to promote someone to replace him, someone more amenable to what you want with Ukraine. And there has been no attempt to do that by the US, by the EU, by no one. And it's really hard to imagine who they would thus elevate, who would presumably do something different, because it's really hard to imagine anyone they could elevate out of the Maidan milieu, right? Out of the greater Maidan regime, Zelensky's and previous, who would sit down and make concessions largely on Russian terms, because that's what these people are arguing, that Trump is looking so that someone who can, agree at least in part to make concessions on a settlement of the conflict with Russia. That's what they're arguing, and I don't see that. Zaluzhny, right? The former head of the Kiev regime's military, whom is still in London, as far as anyone knows, in exile as a quote unquote ambassador, despite not speaking English. He's a Banderite.
Right.
Zelensky has come to Banderism as a result of finding out that is the pillars of the regime that he inherited, and I think has fully internalized it. But Zaluzhny, he is a Banderite. I remember the pictures of him posing for photos inside his military office when he was the king of the military, and he had the big red and black blood and soil banner of the OUN on the back wall, and 2 busts of Stepan Bandera, because one bust isn't enough, and one of Roman Chukovich in that room, right? And he made multiple social media posts, with him smiling with the red and black banner and with statues of Bandera and everything, right? He's committed. So I don't see him as any kind of improvement if what you want is a diplomatic settlement. Quite the opposite. And we haven't, the other possible figures that are only mildly less toxic. Timoshenko, she's been out to pasture in political terms for a long time, and there's been no attempt to elevate her. Poroshenko, he was voted out, by when they're presented with 2 Maidan choices, and that's it, right, in the quote unquote elections that the Kiev regime has held. But he was solidly voted out by the Ukrainian people. They were absolutely through with him. That hasn't stopped his ambitions, but I don't think anyone else really sees him as coming back to helm Ukraine, much less Ukrainians. So it's really hard to see. And there should be some groundwork laid, right, if they're planning to replace him. With who, And again, the U.S. is completely quiet on this. So there's some people that aren't quiet on this, right? And the first one we've already mentioned, Igor Kolomoisky, right? This spurned oligarch patron of Zelensky's, who is openly gloating that Zelensky is gone, and implying that he has a very heavy hand in all of this, even despite being under arrest and further investigation and in and out of court and prison and everything else. But the money does that. But we've also heard a lot recently from Poroshenko, the former candy oligarch, quote unquote, president of the Kiev regime, who still dreams of regaining power, and Klitschko, Vitaly Klitschko, the former boxer and figurehead of the Maidan, whom is the mayor of Kiev, and has long been calling Zelensky a dictator and everything else, which is just ironic because Klitschko, as one of the Maidan leaders, had no problems when the dictatorship was erasing the voices of East Ukraine, right? All the people, the parties, the band in East Ukraine, the leftist parties, the media outlets, the Russian Orthodox, the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, everything that was, he had no problem with that type of dictatorship. But when Zelensky started to gather power away from everyone else except for him in the Maidan regime, then of course, then it's dictatorship, right? But anyway, so they have been making a lot of noise recently. Not noise that I can see has in any way been amplified by the US or the EU, but on their own, right?
Mm-hmm.
And the Ukrainian Telegram channels are full of discussion, right? That this is them and Kolomoisky behind all of this.
Oh, an inside job.
Yes, that this is a dirty knives in the dark, the unsheathing of the knives within the Maidan regime itself. That this is the culmination of some acts of political revenge and political ambitions of some of them, and that this could not come at a worse time for the Kiev regime in general, with the crumbling of the defensive lines in the Donbass and Zaporozhye, with the problem with Russia's long-range strikes on the energy infrastructure, leading to blackouts throughout the country, with the Kiev regime facing a financial apocalypse in the early months of next year, unless Europe coughs up with the money and steals Russia's money, then the regime is going to go bankrupt. I mean, they're going to have to start printing money, devaluing the hryvnia, leading to a crazy economic crisis and political instability within the country that they have avoided because of the constant influx of Western money up until now. But now the spigots are empty. The US has said, no, we're out of this. And the Europeans have to pay for it, and the Europeans can't pay for it.
Right.
So that is, these multiple crises. And then if you have this political instability thrown on top of it, I don't want to say, perfect storm is a cliche, but it's a damn sight of a storm anyway, because it's further destabilizing all of this. Now, you can argue about that, but in either way, it's not in the US's interests or anyone's interests, other than Russia, to destabilize the Kiev regime. So this has nothing to do with that being done intentionally. But I'm perfectly willing to believe that Petro Poroshenko and Kolomoisky and Klitschko and other, top oligarchs that feel slighted and that they should be running the ship are perfectly willing to risk dashing that ship onto the rocks for themselves to gain power. So until I see some sign that the Trump administration is showing a degree of subtlety and conniving that they have never shown thus far, right? Some 5D chess. I know people love to believe that this Trump administration is capable of 5D chess. I've never seen any evidence of it so far. More or even the last administration, but hope for some people dies eternal. So right now, all I see is this is a dirty domestic political knives out within the Maidan regime, mud fight, and if I ate popcorn, I'd be tossing back some popcorn and seeing what's happening, because the political instability can only benefit Russia.
I don't get it though.
Yeah.
Oh no, please finish. I'm sorry. No, please continue.
I was just going to say that. That's one of the reasons that Russia has openly stated that they've never gotten rid of Zelensky, that they've never killed him and his top people or anything, because he's so incompetent at the job that anyone that they replaced him with might be an improvement, and they didn't want. They're quite serious about that. I believe it. They don't want someone who will think rationally, maybe actually let his generals run the war instead of micromanaging it with political, intent, things like that. Russia doesn't want that, right? So they've been I mean, I all the time you hear, why doesn't Russia just take Zelensky and Siersky and these others out? You know, why don't they just send the Reshniks or Kinjals or whatever and take them out? And I mean, the Kiev regime has been quite open that it's tried to kill Putin multiple times and it's just never succeeded. And the reason it's simple is that Russia they would just replace them, and those other people might be more competent, more rational, and so forth. And that's why Russia really has no interest in Zelensky being replaced again by someone potentially. Now, the instability along the way is another story, of course. That's very good for Russia. But I certainly don't think Russia is behind this either. This is some, I believe that for the US and the EU, this is unintended consequences. And you know, the fact that these other political figures within the Maidan have gained you know, control of the process on the ground, as it were, in Kiev, and they're pursuing their own personal agendas. That's what I see right now, right? I perfectly am willing to consider that. The Europeans know. I'm perfectly willing to consider that the Americans have a hand in this. I just haven't seen any evidence at all of it so far.
Yeah. It's weird, though. I mean, because Nebu has been around since the beginning. They obviously are bad at their jobs because, as you point out, corruption is endemic.
They're as corrupt as everyone else.
Yeah. Why. And so it's like now all of a sudden they pop in and be like, hey, there's corruption here. There's gambling in this establishment.
It's just a weapon. It's a weapon for leverage that the US and the EU baked into Ukraine, right? And now I think it's been picked up. But as far as I can tell thus far, it's not the Europeans' hand at the end of the weapon, and it's not even the Americans. It's some dirty Ukrainian politics that are fumbling around with the weapon right now. That's again, I'm waiting to see evidence otherwise that the U.S. might be behind this. I just haven't seen any evidence of it thus far. As soon as I do, I mean, if I do, then I'll let you know. But I'm watching that, and you know, there's talk, but the majority of the talk is about the domestic political implications on the Ukrainian, you know, telegram and political channels. That this is domestic. This is sordid. It's nasty. It's personal. It's not rational, you know, considering the circumstances that the regime is in. But you know, power, it doesn't really, you know, always you know, act on rational interest terms. But I think that the West has just too much invested in the person of Zelensky at this point. There was a point a few years ago, back in 2023, where there was a brief window that they possibly could have replaced him with Zelensky, but they didn't move on it back then. And I now any move to replace him risks bringing the whole thing down. The whole, you know, the whole rotten house of cards. I would consider it too risky. Now, I believe that Trump doesn't give two figs about Zelensky. I believe that Trump has nothing but contempt for Zelensky, as he has nothing but contempt for Macron and Starmer and these others. But the U.S. government, right, the real U.S. government, the deep state, the blob, whatever you want to call it, I think as far as they're concerned, the preservation of Zelensky, at least, you know, at the current time, is essential. That it's too late to jump horses midstream, you know, at this point.
Yeah.
But I mean, it's a question. Who is controlling this? Is the U.S. really behind this, which would make a degree of sense? Or is this a lot more chaotic and simply domestically, you know, personal and power based, and the U.S. has just lost control of the weapon? But ultimately, if it's not the U.S., then I think Zelensky is at the end of the day safe, right? No one is going to be able to remove him without a green light from the U.S. because ultimately, even if the U.S. is not directly supplying the money and the arms, it's coming through their vassals in Europe. Ultimately, the U.S. controls that process. And if the U.S. isn't happy about the overthrow of Zelensky, then they can just cut off that tap completely. Everyone knows that, right? The regime in Kiev survives because the U.S. demands that it be so, until Russia removes it, physically from the board,
Right.
which is still down the road. So if Zelensky does go, then that's a green light for that the U.S. is behind it. But I don't see that. Right? I see him weakened. I see him reeling. I see him becoming even more unhinged. I see people next to him falling left and right and having to be replaced. I see, his power base in Ukraine weakening, but I don't see him removed. Now, there is a possible he could attempt to Judas Goat this whole thing if Timur Mindich isn't enough. And Timur Mindich, right, he is referred to in the Ukrainian, the Kiev regime's press as Zelensky's wallet, right? He was the co-founder and co-owner of Zelensky's comedy company, Kvartal 95, with Zelensky, right? They were in on it together from the beginning. Mm-hmm. And Mindich was never brought into the government per se, but according to multiple accounts, he's still, Zelensky's principal, confidant and backer, particularly since Kolomoisky, he turned on Kolomoisky on the scene. And this guy who had never had anything to do with defense in his life or anything, right? Comedy company. He started up from scratch drone companies, defense companies making drones and no bid contracts. And he got control of a big part of the energy center through Ukraine Energo, the nuclear portion of their power system and everything, which is part of this whole corruption scheme. It's all about contracts and even the idea that you have to pay to Mindich just to get access to contracts, right? That sort of thing going on. That's where all of this is. And as you said, Mindich has fled the country. The Justice Ministry and the Energy Minister who are implicated have resigned and will probably flee the country if they can. And the other one who has fled the country is the Kiev regime's former defense minister and still chair of their security council, Rustem Umarov, who hours, like with Mindich, hours before the Nabu people showed up at his house, he fled the country first to Turkey, where he has a lot of close contacts, and then supposedly on to the UAE and Qatar. But no one expects him to actually come back to Ukraine at this point. So there's there's definitely a crisis going on, but right now I don't. Kolomoisky seems Kolomoisky is actually reacting a bit. He's gloating, but he's also reacting angrily at the focus on Mindich, saying, "No, it's not just Mindich; it's someone else." I'm not saying Zelensky, but over there, look at him. That's he's actually acting a little peeved that all the attention is on Mindich more than Zelensky at the moment. So again, that's why I see, and I do not see the U.S. working through Kolomoisky. Right? They have the U.S. has no particular love for Kolomoisky. In fact, there's evidence that they encouraged Zelensky to bite the hand that fed him at some point in the last few years. And they've actually sanctioned Kolomoisky, I believe, to some degree. Wow. So that's why I find the idea of U.S. traces makes sense, but I haven't seen any evidence leading to it. And I've seen evidence to the contrary thus far. But yeah, it's a mess. But I don't see it toppling Zelensky again unless the U.S., the Trump administration, for lack of a better term, gives the green light.